Okay, welcome. So today I wanted to offer a few reflections about the Indian film RRR and the connection to the British Raj and just what the film is talking about, just some ideas how that links into boarding school and the education of many of those who went and ran the Raj. Okay, so a couple of days ago I watched the excellent film RRR, which is an Indian film which is from 2022, directed by Rajamouli, and it was starring Ram Charam and NT Rama Rao Jr. And these two characters, Ram Charam and NT Rama Rao Jr., they play this character Raju and also this character Bheem. Now, what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is just that crossover with the British Empire. You know, there was a few things which really stood out as I was watching it, going, I can see how that links into boarding school and the education of many of those who went out, which is outlined in Nick Duffel's book, Wounded Leaders. Nick Duffel spent time in India after he'd left Oxford University. So essentially the story of the film, I won't go into much depth, but essentially it is that the governor of India, whether it's actually just the state of one of the main states, but he goes into a village with his wife and the wife says, I want that child. And they take a child out of the village and the villagers are horrified. And, you know, the reflection is there is, you know, the film is about this character Bheem trying to get the child back, trying to reunite the child with their family. Now, as I watched this, there was also a bit where I think it's Bheem or one of the other characters saying, well, where are the British children? When Bheem tries to go and rescue the character at one point, he says, well, one of them says, where are the British children? And the British children essentially have been sent home to Britain, to England, to go to boarding school. And so it's this process of, this is what we do. We separate children from their families. And, you know, what the film is trying to say is this cruelty that you can see with the British Empire, and essentially, you know, it's anti-imperialist. So I wanted to read a little bit from Nick Duffel's work just to get a sense of, you know, how this happened. So Britain has had for generations of such wounded people because this psychic state has transgenerational implications. In other words, unless challenged, it replicates itself over time. So what he's talking about is these people who've been gone off to boarding school, essentially received a wounding, and you know, he talking about Professor Joy Chavrin in her work with boarding school syndrome. It leads to the passing down of a selection of undesirable psychological traits such as immaturity and lack of empathy, which we see a lot in the film. The resulting behavioral patterns can exhibit selfishness, duplicity, misogyny, bullying. Okay, we see these again in the film by the leaders. They may be adversarial or alternatively placatory, sometimes accompanied by extreme deprecation and shyness. Above all, an unfamiliarity with emotional states and anxiety rooted in having developed self-reliance too early at the expense of satisfying and valuing belonging needs will be unwittingly motivating these behaviors and crystallized by a sense of entitlement. So we see that a lot with the Raj, is this entitlement that, no, we are having this. Someone contacted me a couple of years ago that they pointed out, I think it's 40 to 60 trillion dollars of wealth was taken out of India during the British Raj. So I'll read on a little bit later on. He says, I knew that the Raj had principally been run by young men from stiff Victorian English families. Less than 70 years earlier, the 40-year-old Viceroy Lord Curzon ruled a land of 300 million Indians with a staff of only 150,000 Brits. Presumably most of them stepped straight out of public school into imperial service. A bit like me in my current job, I suppose. So he was working in a boarding school in India. But I knew I was bluffing it, and I wondered how I was getting away with it. So how on earth did they get away with ruling over this massive, enchanting, but chaotic and bizarre land? All I could imagine was that by serving in the Raj, they would never really have needed to leave school, for the institutions they passed through would have been run on very similar lines. They could have remained public schoolboy gentlemen, bumble through as if the whole thing were a debating club or like Parliament, as if the Indians were unruly new boys and they are the privileged prefects. It took me a long time to find more of an answer. So that's just some ideas there of, okay. And he goes into a bit more depth later on in the book. But he also says here, later on I discovered that I was not alone in such speculation. The travel writer Bruce Chatwin had called the British Empire a world run by overgrown boys. And all the while these overgrown schoolboys maintained that the natives, heirs to one of the world's most profound philosophic systems, were not competent to look after themselves. Though the history of the British domination of India did not lack brutality, sheer force was not its prime feature. Military might alone could not account for the success, I reckoned. And he talks about that a little bit later on. So I will draw upon that. So yeah, he talks about here, he just goes, the British working class, so he talks about that we use this in the British Empire to oppress the indigenous people, but he's saying now that what has happened is that the British elite are now oppressing the working class. And he says this: the British working class have been left stranded by the Rational Man project. They have picked up all the disowned material from the rigid stance of the British class system that demands that someone has to be at the bottom, and this won't be the elite. But now the sun has gone down on the British Empire, there are no more natives for Rational Man to be above, save those immigrants at home, many of whom seem much more socially adaptable than he is. We have worked the British Raj trick on our own people. They feel bad about themselves from the inside. So this is what he's pointing out, is that is, and this kind of coming back into the film, that is how we managed to dominate, is rather than through force or means, it was to shame these people, to somehow think that they were less than, that they were somehow dirty or stupid. And this is what he's talking about, this Rational Man project. And then I'll just read, his last conclusion about that. It says, Imperial Britain had already got used to the absence of the nurturing feminine principle and came up with an ingenious and precise tool for bringing non-rational elements under its thumb, specifically its own children and the indigenous world. This was the cult of breaking children away from their roots. This was how the British Raj did the trick to the South Asian Indians, as well as to her own people. So I just thought it was really fascinating watching this film, and obviously the film it's based on historical events, but these two characters, Bheem and Raju, never actually met in real life. They, certainly Bheem was inspired by Raju, but it was actually in the film certain events which happened, like the death of his father. It was actually Bheem who had that event happen from the British, rather than from the in the film it's Raju who that happens to. So I just think it's fascinating just to explore these things. What did the British do, and why did we do this? Not to shame or to blame, but to bring to light, to realize, maybe this is still being held by the Indian people. Certainly a lot of the British wealth was garnered from from India, from Africa, you know, and that's been proven. So just to ask these questions, and I think I really recommend it. You can find it on Netflix, RRR. Really recommend watching it. It's got some lovely dancing in it. It's got some, you know, some amazing fight scenes, some action, and there's a love story in there as well. Yeah, and it's kind of based a little bit on the Indian myths, you know, these two characters. So yeah, it's a really beautiful story. So enjoy. Any questions, please let me know.